Chapter 1. A Tangle of Bonds. It was the kind of evening that trickled by in moments of introspective silence. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows that stretched across the room, painting the walls in hues of gold and orange. I sat in the dim corner of the living room, the silence almost oppressive. My fingers absently traced the edge of a glass, the faint scent of whiskey lingering in the air. But it was neither the drink nor the quiet that had me captivated. No, it was the way my thoughts were now tangled in a knot, one that refused to loosen no matter how much I tried to pull at the threads. Why had it come to this? I wasn't sure when the first crack had appeared in my marriage. Maybe it had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface like a quiet storm waiting for the right moment to break. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be pinpointed with clarity, but rather a slow, inevitable unraveling of something that once seemed so perfect. I thought back to the early days. Julia, my wife, was everything I had ever wanted. She was vibrant, full of life, with a laugh that could light up the darkest of rooms. Her smile was easy, effortless, and when we first met, it was as if the world had stopped for a moment just to let me bask in her presence. But somewhere along the line, the laughter began to fade, replaced by silence. The spontaneous outings became routine, and the passion that had once ignited our nights was now a distant memory, buried beneath the weight of responsibilities. But then, there was Mary, my mother-in-law. She entered the room just as I was lost in thought. Her presence, somehow both soothing and unsettling. Mary had that rare quality. She was poised, graceful, yet there was something about her that made me feel uncertain. It wasn't her age, though she had certainly aged like fine wine, nor her beauty, though she was stunning. No, it was her ability to command a room without uttering a word. Her eyes, a deep shade of green, always seemed to be looking right through you, like she could see the very depths of your soul. As she entered the living room, she gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had that look in her eyes that made it clear she knew something was wrong. Her posture, upright and elegant, was always a stark contrast to the weight that hung in the air when I was around her. We exchanged pleasantries, but there was an unspoken tension between us, one that had been building ever since I began to spend more time with her. "You've been quiet tonight," she remarked, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that made me feel like I was being inspected under a microscope. "I've been thinking," I replied, trying to sound casual, but the words were hollow. The truth was I hadn't stopped thinking for days. About her, about Julia, about everything. Mary didn't press me further, but I could see the flicker of curiosity in her gaze. She always had a way of getting people to talk, of peeling back the layers until the truth was exposed, whether you wanted it to be or not. I found myself wondering why I had never noticed how intoxicating her presence was before. There was a depth to Mary that I couldn't quite place, an air of wisdom maybe, or something darker, more intimate. As the evening wore on, the lines between us began to blur. The conversation turned to trivial matters at first, what I had been up to, what Julia was doing. But there was an unspoken shift in the air. The way Mary moved closer to me as we spoke, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of my hand when she passed me a glass. My heart raced in a way I hadn't expected, like a drumbeat steadily increasing in tempo, urging me forward despite the conflicting thoughts that tore at me. What was this? The warmth of her touch, the heat in her gaze. It all felt too much. Yet, beneath it all, something inside me felt alive again. The spark that had been missing for so long suddenly reignited. But that spark came with a terrifying realization. What was I doing? She leaned in closer, her breath warm against my ear, her voice a soft whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't you miss feeling alive?" she asked, her words heavy, with implication. And in that moment, I felt it. The pull, the temptation, the quiet voice in my head that urged me to cross a line I had never even considered before. To be continued. Chapter 2. The web tightens. The following days were a blur, moments stretching like elastic, snapping back into place before I could fully grasp them. Each time I saw Mary, I felt that same tension coil tighter in my chest. It wasn't just her proximity or her touch that lingered in my thoughts, but the unspoken promise behind every interaction. She was a puzzle I couldn't quite solve, and the more I tried, the more I found myself tangled in the strands of her allure. I had convinced myself that it was a passing infatuation, something that would fade as quickly as it had come. After all, Mary was my mother-in-law. There was a boundary, an invisible line that should never be crossed. Yet, with each encounter, that line seemed less defined, more like a suggestion than a rule. That night, Julia came home later than usual. I could hear the faint sound of her heels clicking against the floor as she entered the house, her tired sigh cutting through the stillness. I hadn't seen her all day, and my heart sank a little at the distance I had been feeling between us. She was still beautiful, still the woman I had fallen in love with, but it was as if we were strangers now. She barely looked at me as she hung her coat on the rack and walked past me to the kitchen. What happened to us? Her gaze was distant, distracted, and I couldn't help but wonder if she knew. If she had noticed the subtle changes, the tension in the air that seemed to pulse with every passing second. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. How was work? She paused, her back still turned to me as she rummaged through the kitchen. Busy. You know how it is. She didn't sound angry or upset, just tired. And that made me feel worse, like I had failed her in ways I couldn't even put into words. But it was when Mary called later that evening that the true weight of the situation hit me. Her voice was a soft melody on the other end of the line, a contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. "Are you still awake?" she asked, a subtle hint of something darker in her tone, something that made my pulse quicken. "Yeah," I replied, almost instinctively, my hand gripping the edge of the phone as if it were the only tether keeping me grounded. "I'm awake." "I'm lonely," she said, her words slipping like silk through the air. "Could you come over? I think I need someone to talk to." I didn't hesitate, not for a second. Why did I not hesitate? I asked myself later, but at that moment, the decision felt inevitable, as though it had already been made before I even picked up the phone. I arrived at Mary's house just after midnight, the cold night air wrapping itself around me as I stepped from my car. The driveway was empty, save for my own vehicle, and the house stood dark and silent like a shadow waiting to be disturbed. Her front door was already slightly ajar when I reached it. I knocked softly, but the sound was absorbed by the stillness. As I stepped inside, I could see her silhouette in the dim hallway, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the floor. She was waiting for me, as if she had known I would come. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice low, warm, like a whisper meant only for me. Her eyes gleamed in the half-light, sharp and intent, as though she were reading me, seeing, through every hesitation. I swallowed, trying to ignore the way her presence seemed to seep into every fiber of my being. "You needed someone to talk to?" I asked, the question sounding foreign on my tongue, though I knew it was a lie. There was something else, something more. Mary stepped closer, the scent of jasmine and vanilla enveloping me. "I don't think it's talking I need right now," she murmured, her hand brushing lightly against mine. That touch, that innocent, casual brush sent a jolt through me. Every nerve in my body seemed to wake up, as if something deep inside me had been lying dormant for far too long. God help me. Why does it feel so right? I stepped back, but only by a fraction. The space between us seemed impossibly small now. My breath was shallow, my pulse erratic. She tilted her head, her eyes softening, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else, something vulnerable, something that hadn't been there before. "I've always wondered," she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "if you regret it." I stared at her, caught off guard by the sudden question. "Regret what?" I asked, my voice thick with confusion. "Marrying Julia," she said, each word heavy with meaning. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you had chosen differently? If you had followed your heart instead of doing what was expected of you?" Her gaze never wavered from mine, and I felt as though she were reaching into the depths of my soul, exposing everything I had tried to keep hidden. "Does she know?" I began, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? How could I answer a question that had been haunting me? Chapter 3. Unspoken Truths. The silence that followed Mary's touch was suffocating, heavy with unspoken words, lingering desires, and the taste of something forbidden. Her fingers were still wrapped around mine, and despite every rational instinct urging me to pull away, I found myself unable to move. Her grip was gentle, almost comforting, as though she were offering me something I couldn't quite understand, but craved nonetheless. I looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time, not as my mother-in-law, not as a figure who had merely been a distant presence in my life. No, now she was something different. The woman before me was radiant, her eyes searching, mine with an intensity that made my skin flush, my breath hitch in my throat. Her expression was a delicate mixture of hope and longing, as though she were waiting for something from me, something I wasn't ready to give but couldn't stop myself from yearning for. "I don't regret it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. What was I supposed to say? That I didn't feel the weight of unspoken desire when I was with her? That I didn't feel something else stir inside me when her gaze lingered a moment too long? When her touch was just a fraction too lingering? She seemed to sense my hesitation, her eyes softening. Slowly, she let go of my hand. But the distance between us felt like miles, even though physically we remained inches apart. The tension in the room thickened, curling around us like smoke. "I see," she said, her voice softer now, a hint of sadness creeping into her tone. "It's just, I think sometimes people forget that there's more to a marriage than just the surface. You might not regret it, but I think you're starting to realize that something has been missing for a long time." I didn't know what to say. Was she right? Was she really seeing something I hadn't? My mind spun, but I couldn't find the words to express what was going on inside of me. What was I feeling? Was it guilt? Desire? Was I really considering what I thought I was considering? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could form the words, Mary stepped closer once more, her gaze never leaving mine. There was a softness in her eyes now, an understanding that was both comforting and unsettling. "I've never wanted to make you feel uncomfortable," she said, her hand gently brushing against my arm. I've always seen something in you, something more than just the man who married my daughter." I felt my heart race again, the adrenaline surging through my veins. What was she saying? What was she offering? Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. A sharp knock on the door broke the spell, and I jumped, my pulse spiking as the reality of the situation crashed down on me. I couldn't even think straight anymore. "Who is it?" Mary called, her voice composed, but I could sense the tension in her tone. "It's me." Julia's voice came from the other side, muffled but clear. I froze. The door handle clicked softly, and my stomach dropped. Mary quickly stepped back, her posture shifting instantly, like she had been caught in the act of something she hadn't yet fully decided on. She glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher, one that was equal parts regret and something else, something darker. "Just a minute," she called out, her voice smooth but laced with an edge I'd never heard before. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, unsure of what to do next. My body was frozen, locked in a moment of indecision as Julia's footsteps grew closer. I could hear the sound of her breathing, slow, steady, each step bringing her closer to the room. I should leave. I should walk out. But I couldn't. What was I even doing here? My thoughts collided, tumbling over one another as I stood frozen, caught between the two women in my life. One I had pledged to love and cherish, the other whose touch had begun to haunt my every thought. As the door opened slowly, Julia appeared. In the doorway, her eyes locking with mine for a moment before shifting to Mary, who had stepped back and was now standing across the room, looking every bit the composed woman I had always known her to be. "Is everything all right?" Julia asked, her brow furrowing as she took in the strange atmosphere in the room. It was a question that lingered in the air, hanging between us like a fragile thread, ready to snap at the slightest tug. "Of course," Mary replied smoothly, her voice neutral, but I could see the flicker of something, an unspoken truth, pass between them. I wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize, to clarify the chaos that had spiraled in my mind. But the words refused to come, and instead I stood there, my heart in my throat, feeling more trapped than I had ever felt before. Julia didn't seem to notice the tension as she walked past me heading to the kitchen. That evening, I sat in the living room, the faint light of the setting sun filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Julia was in the kitchen humming to herself as she prepared dinner. I had always loved that sound, the way she sang, or rather hummed, as though she had forgotten anyone was listening. It was a small thing, but it had always felt like a private moment between us. But today, even her familiar hum felt distant, like an echo from a past life. "What's happening to me?" I stood up abruptly, pacing the floor. I couldn't sit still anymore, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming need to do something, anything, to resolve this torment. Mary's face flashed in my mind, her eyes so intense, so knowing. Her words echoed in my ears. "I think sometimes people forget that there's more to a marriage than just the surface." Was she right? I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed out a text to her. The words came out before I could stop them. "Can we talk? I need to understand what's happening between us." The reply came almost instantly. "Tonight, same place, 9 Sao." I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart pounding. Every instinct told me to erase the message, to forget it ever happened. But instead, I set the phone down and tried to breathe, to calm myself. Julia would never know. She couldn't know. The hours dragged by. Every minute felt like an eternity. As the clock ticked toward 9 I grew more agitated. The distance between me and Julia seemed to stretch, to grow heavier with every passing second. I found myself avoiding her gaze, the conversation stilted, awkward. She noticed, of course, but she said nothing. I could hear the faint sound of her moving about the house, the soft shuffle of her slippers on the floor. She was so close, but it was like we were worlds apart. What happened to us? I pushed the thought aside, grabbed my coat, and headed out the door without a word. The drive to Mary's house was quick, the roads almost empty in the late hour. I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me as I pulled into her driveway. The house stood dark and silent, but I could feel her presence waiting for me, as if she were standing right behind the door, ready to open it the moment I arrived. I knocked just once, but it was enough. The door opened almost immediately, And there she was, Mary. Her eyes were soft but intense, like they had been waiting for this moment, and I couldn't look away. She stepped aside without a word, her gaze never leaving mine as I walked in. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change, thicker, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. "I didn't want to say anything before," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "but I think you know what's happening here." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Do I?" I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. Mary nodded, taking a slow step closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "I think you do," she said, her voice barely audible now. "You've been avoiding it, but we both know what this is." I felt my breath catch in my throat. She was so close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body, the faint scent of her perfume, the softness of her skin just inches away from mine. It was intoxicating. I should step back. I should say something, anything to stop this from going further. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, my body betraying me, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. "What do we do now?" I whispered, my voice shaky with uncertainty. Mary's gaze flickered to my lips, and then back to my eyes, a flicker of something deeper there, something that mirrored my own confusion, my own fear. "We do what feels right," she said, her hand reaching up, gently grazing my cheek. Her touch sent a wave of warmth through my body, a wave that crashed over my better judgment, drowning it. I closed my eyes for a moment, the sensation too much. And when I opened them again, her face was even closer, her lips just a breath away from mine. The tension in the room was unbearable. My heart raced, and yet I couldn't pull away. She leaned in, just slightly, her lips brushing against mine in a soft, tentative kiss. I felt my body respond before my mind could even process what was happening. The kiss deepened, and in that moment, all the weight of my guilt, my confusion, and my longing seemed to dissolve into nothingness. There was only her, only the heat between us, the pull that had been building for so long. What have I done? I pulled away, my chest heaving, my breath ragged. "I can't," I said, the words breaking through the haze of desire. "I can't do this." Mary stepped back, her eyes searching mine, her lips trembling as if she were about to say something. But the words never came. "I know," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted you to know that it's not just you who feels this." Chapter 5. Consequences in the quiet. The night air felt cold, biting against my skin as I walked back to my car. My thoughts were a whirlwind, each one crashing against the next with no order, no sense of direction. I couldn't understand. What had just happened? Couldn't make sense of the emotions that had erupted in me like a storm, leaving me shaken and unsure of where I stood. The kiss. What did it mean? My chest ached as I replayed the moment over and over again in my mind. Mary's lips against mine, the raw intensity that had surged through me, and then the crushing weight of guilt that followed it. I could still taste her, feel her presence all over me, like her touch had branded my skin. I sat in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The engine hummed to life, but I didn't move right away. I needed time to gather my thoughts, to calm the raging storm inside me. But the more I tried to control my thoughts, the harder it became to push them away. What do I do now? I hadn't meant for this to happen. I hadn't meant to cross that line. But in that moment, when Mary had stood so close, her breath mingling with mine, it felt like I didn't have a choice. It felt like everything had led up to this undeniable connection, this pull that I couldn't explain but couldn't resist. As I drove back to the house, the quiet night seemed to mock me. The steady hum of the tires on the asphalt, providing an eerie soundtrack to my own turmoil. I thought of Julia, of the woman I had pledged my life to. How could I face her after what I had just done? How could I go back to the life we had, knowing what had transpired between me and her mother? She doesn't deserve this. I pulled into the driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I parked the car. The house loomed before me, dark and quiet. Inside, I knew Julia would be waiting. The faint sound of her humming would fill the silence. The home we had built together, the life we had shared, all of it felt so far away now, like a distant memory. I couldn't touch. I stood outside the car for a long moment, the cold wind pressing against me, but I couldn't move. My mind raced with the enormity of what I had done. How had everything become so entangled? How had I gotten to this point? I finally forced myself to open the door, the familiar warmth of the house hitting me like a wave. Julia was in the kitchen, her back to me as she stirred something in a pot. She didn't look up when I entered, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was lost in thought. I stood in the doorway watching her, feeling like a stranger in my own home. How could I even begin to act normal after everything that had happened? "Hey," I said, my voice sounding hollow, even to my own ears. Julia glanced over her shoulder, her eyes lighting up for a moment before her smile faltered. She could see it in my face, the unease, the confusion. She was too perceptive for her own good. She could always tell when something was off. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with concern. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself walking toward her, my body moving on its own, driven by a need I couldn't explain. I reached for her, pulling her into my arms, holding her tightly as if I could erase the guilt I felt. She didn't resist, but I could feel the tension in her body. She was waiting for me to say something, to explain what had happened. She could feel the distance growing between us, and I knew that it wouldn't be long before she would ask what was wrong. But I couldn't say. Not yet. "I'm fine," I said, my voice more of a lie than I cared to admit. "I'm just tired." Her eyes softened, but she didn't push me. Instead, she kissed me on the cheek, the warmth of her lips against my skin almost too much to bear. "Get some rest," she murmured, her hand lingering on my chest for a moment before she stepped back. I watched her as she returned to the stove, her movements graceful and calm, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. It wasn't just in her eyes. It was in the way she held herself, the way she moved through the house like she was on autopilot. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between two worlds. One foot in the life I had built, with Julia, the other in the new, dangerous path that had opened up with Mary. I retreated to the bedroom, but sleep didn't come. My mind wouldn't let me rest, wouldn't let me forget the kiss, the weight of it, the way it had felt like I was crossing a line I couldn't come back from. I kept seeing Mary's face, her eyes filled with a quiet longing, a promise of something more. And then Julia's face, full of trust, of love, of everything I had ever wanted. What do I want? I sat up in bed, my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. In the darkness, I could hear the soft murmur of Julia moving through the house. Chapter 6. Fractured Realities. The days following that night felt like a blur. Every morning I woke with the weight of what I had done pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I'd glance at Julia, at her innocent smile, and I'd feel the stark contrast between what I was pretending to be and what I knew I had become, a stranger in my own life. At work, the hours dragged on, every second filled with an overwhelming sense of disconnection. I couldn't focus, couldn't concentrate on anything other than the chaos that had taken root in my mind. My interactions, with my colleagues felt hollow, like I was walking through a dream, detached from the world around me. I wasn't living in reality anymore. I was lost in a storm of guilt, desire, and confusion. By the time I got home that evening, the tension between Julia and me had reached a point where it was almost suffocating. She had been quiet, her usual warmth and affection replaced by a palpable distance. She hadn't confronted me directly, but the signs were there. Her eyes no longer sparkled with the same affection when she looked at me. The way she moved through the house was more mechanical, as if she were going through the motions without truly being present. I knew she was waiting for me to come clean, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to face the consequences of what I'd done. As I walked through the door, Julia was sitting at the dining table, a glass of wine in hand, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim. She didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel her eyes on me, silently waiting for me to speak. "Hey," I said, trying to force a smile, but it felt weak, brittle. She didn't respond immediately, but I could sense the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. Finally, she put the glass down, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been distant," she said. "I feel like you're slipping away." My throat went dry, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The truth was there, just beneath the surface, threatening to spill out. But how could I say it? How could I tell her that the distance between us wasn't just because of work or stress, but because of the overwhelming pull I felt toward someone else? "I've just been dealing with a lot," I muttered, unable to meet her gaze. Julia's eyes softened for a moment, but then there was a flicker of something else, something I couldn't quite place. She leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "I know when something's wrong, you know," she said. "And I'm not stupid. If something's happening, if you're seeing someone else, I need to know." The words hung in, the air like a guillotine, and for a moment I was frozen. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to deny it, to assure her that everything was fine, that it was just a phase, but I couldn't bring myself to lie to her. Not anymore. I'm not seeing anyone else," I finally said. But even as the words left my mouth, they felt like a betrayal. Because in some part of me, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Not in the way she thought. Julia studied me for a long moment, her gaze intense, probing. "Then why have you been acting like this?" she asked. "Why do I feel like I'm losing?" "You?" "Because I am slipping away," I wanted to say. "Because someone else has taken hold of me in ways I can't control." But I didn't say it. Instead, I shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through my hair, trying to gather the words that wouldn't betray me. "I'm just tired," I muttered, not even recognizing the stranger who had taken over my voice. Julia seemed to buy it, though there was still that lingering doubt in her eyes. She gave me a small nod, the kind of gesture she always made when she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, even when it wasn't. She stood up, taking her glass of wine with her, and walked toward the kitchen. "I'm going to bed," she said, her voice quiet, distant. "We can talk tomorrow. I just need some space." I nodded, but I didn't move. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty chair she had just vacated, the space between us stretching wider with every passing second. My heart clenched, and I felt the ache in my chest deepen. But even as I felt the weight of my guilt, there was something else inside me, something darker, something that made me want to feel free of the chains of my own conscience. The night dragged on, the house silent, except for the sound of my own restless thoughts. At some point, I found myself reaching for my phone. Without thinking, my thumb hovered over Mary's name in my contacts. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of the decision pulling me in two directions. Don't do it. But the pull was undeniable. I tapped her name, and within seconds, the screen lit up with a message from her. "I've been thinking about you all day," it read. My pulse quickened, a mixture of guilt and longing flooding my veins. Chapter 7. Unraveling the Threads. The night felt like an eternity. I could hear the sound of my own breath, steady but strained in the silence of the bedroom. The phone buzzed again. I looked at it, Mary's name flashing on the screen, her words echoing in my mind. "We need to talk. Come over." I felt the pull again, an insatiable craving that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much my mind screamed at me to stop, to go back to the life I had built. It was too late for that now. The door had been opened, and there was no going back. I rose slowly, careful not to make a sound as I moved toward the door. The house was still, almost too still. Julia's soft breathing drifted from the bedroom, a stark reminder of the quiet fracture that had begun to grow between us. I couldn't help but feel that I was betraying her in the most visceral way, but the desire to see Mary, to answer the pull that had become an obsession, overwhelmed my guilt. With every step I took toward the door, I felt like I was stepping deeper into a void, one that swallowed me whole, making me forget everything that I had promised to hold dear. I pulled my coat on, my hands moving with a mechanical precision, as I grabbed my keys. The weight of the decision pressed against my chest, and yet I couldn't stop. I opened the door as quietly as I could, but the soft creak of it seemed deafening in the silence. I glanced back at the darkened bedroom, feeling the weight of Julia's absence pressing down on me. She was still asleep, unaware of the storm that was about to break. And yet, even as I moved toward the car, I knew that this night would be the one that shattered everything. I could feel it in the air, thick, heavy with the unspoken words between me and Julia, between Mary and me. The drive felt like it took hours, though it was only a few minutes. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest as I thought about what awaited me on the other side of the door that Mary had opened. The truth of it hung over me like a dark cloud, one I had allowed to fester until it was impossible to ignore. When I finally arrived, I didn't even bother knocking. The door opened almost immediately, and there she was, Mary, standing in the doorway, her dark eyes glinting with an unreadable emotion. She was wearing a loose sweater, the fabric soft and worn, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders, the strands catching the low light of the hallway. She stepped aside wordlessly, allowing me to enter. The door clicked softly behind me, and the room felt unnaturally still, like the air itself was holding its breath. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of everything, unsaid, pressing between us like a physical force. Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but she didn't. She didn't need to. The tension in the room was thick enough to drown us both. "I shouldn't be here," I finally whispered, the words tasting foreign as they left my lips. Mary didn't respond immediately. She just walked closer, her movements slow, deliberate. The scent of her skin, the soft warmth of her presence, filled the air between us, and I felt the weight of her gaze like a touch, like an invitation I couldn't ignore. "I've been waiting for you," she murmured, her voice low, almost like a secret. "I knew you'd come." God, why did that sound so right, I thought. My pulse quickened, my body betraying me in ways I couldn't control. My mind screamed at me to leave, to walk away. But my feet were frozen, rooted to the floor as Mary reached out to touch my arm, her fingers brushing against my skin. I looked down at her hand, and then up into her eyes. There was no turning back from this, no right decision. Only the raw, unspoken connection that pulsed between us like a magnet, pulling us closer with every breath. Before I could stop myself, I was pulling her toward me, my hands on her shoulders, and then her lips were on mine. I felt the heat of her body pressing against mine, and for a brief moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was only the kiss, only the desperate need that had built between us since the moment we had crossed paths. It wasn't just physical. It was deeper, something darker. Something I didn't understand but couldn't resist. I could taste her, sweet, like something forbidden, and feel the way her hands slid up to my chest, pulling me closer, as if she, too, couldn't deny this pull. It was like the universe had conspired to make this happen, like every step I had taken had led me here, to this place of no return. Her body was warm, pressed against mine, and I felt every inch of her as if it were my own. Her breath was uneven, quick, and I knew she was just as lost in this as I was. But somewhere deep inside, a voice kept whispering, "This is wrong. Julia doesn't deserve this. You don't deserve this." But the words were fading, drowned out by the flood of desire. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The hours that followed felt like a slow unraveling, each passing minute stretching longer than the last, each beat of my heart a reminder of how far I had fallen. I sat there on the edge of Mary's couch, my body, still humming with the lingering warmth of our kiss. It was as though the world had tilted on its axis, and I was caught in a disorienting spin, unable to find my footing. My thoughts swirled. Julia's face, the memory of her smile, the sound of her voice now distant in my mind as I tried to reconcile the two worlds I was now living in. Mary sat across from me, her presence undeniable, her gaze unwavering. There was no comfort in her eyes, no gentle understanding, just a raw, knowing look that made me feel both alive and hollow at the same time. "Do you ever stop and think about how we got here?" she asked, her voice low, almost too quiet. I swallowed, the question hanging in the air like a weight that pressed against my chest. The answer was simple. I hadn't stopped thinking. Not for a second. The guilt, the confusion, the overwhelming desire, it all collided inside me in a way that I couldn't begin to untangle. "I don't know," I muttered, shaking my head as I looked down at my hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Mary's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it, only a quiet understanding of the mess I had created. "No one ever does," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But now that you're here, what are you going to do about it?" The question was like a knife in my chest, cutting through the fog of my emotions and forcing me to face the truth I had been avoiding. The truth was, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this, how to piece together the wreckage of my life. I had walked into this blindly, and now, standing at the edge of it all, I couldn't tell where the path led anymore. I ran a hand through my hair, a sharp ache piercing my skull. "I don't know if I can go back to her," I confessed, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I don't know if I can pretend anymore that everything's okay." Mary's eyes softened with something that felt like pity, but also something darker, something I couldn't quite identify. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached for the glass of wine on the table, her fingers brushing the rim as she took a slow sip. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with tension that crackled like static electricity, making it impossible for me to think clearly. "Then why are you still there?" she asked finally, her voice so quiet that it almost felt like an accusation. I flinched, the question reverberating through me, pushing me to confront the thing I had been avoiding. Why was I still there? Why had I allowed this to spiral out of control? It wasn't like I didn't care for Julia. It wasn't that I didn't love her. But somewhere along the way, I had allowed the quiet spaces between us to grow too wide, too deep. I had stopped listening, stopped trying. The silence between us stretched longer, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "I don't know," I said again, the words feeling hollow in my mouth. "I don't know what's real anymore." Mary leaned back into the couch, her gaze never leaving me. "It's easy to get lost in this, you know," she said softly. to pretend that the feelings you have for someone else are the only ones that matter. But the truth is, you can't run from yourself, not forever. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say something to defend myself, to justify what had happened, but the words stuck in my throat, leaving me speechless. There was no excuse for what I had done. No way to erase the hurt I had caused. "I don't want to hurt her," I said finally, the confession tasting bitter on my tongue. "But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to go back to what we were." Mary's gaze softened, but it was a sadness that didn't belong to me. It was a sadness that belonged to her, a grief I couldn't quite understand, but that I felt nonetheless. "You don't have to go back," she said quietly. "You just have to figure out what you really want, what you can live with." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words sinking deep into me. What did I want? What was left for me in this tangled mess of desire, guilt, and confusion? The drive back home was torturous. Every mile, every turn, felt like I was being drawn into a final confrontation with the reality I had been avoiding. The night had stretched on so long that the sky had begun to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. But it was the darkness inside me that had taken root, and it was that darkness I couldn't escape. I parked in the driveway, my hands trembling as I shut off the engine. The house in front of me looked so ordinary, so deceptively peaceful. Julia's car was still there. She was still inside, but I wasn't sure how to face her. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring at Julia. The soft rise and fall of her chest as she slept was the only thing that anchored me to reality. Her face was peaceful, unaware of the storm that had been raging inside me for hours. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of everything that had happened, everything that I had done, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, I didn't know where to start. My mind was a jumble of words, of apologies, of explanations that I wasn't sure I even believed in anymore. I had betrayed her. The woman who had loved me, trusted me, stood by me through it all, and I had thrown that away without a second thought. I watched her for a long time, my heart aching in ways I didn't know were possible. She had always been the center of my world, the one I could count on, the one who had always believed in us. But I had taken her love, her faith, and shattered it in the most irreparable way. I moved quietly to the edge of the bed, my footsteps muffled on the carpet. Her eyes fluttered open, the soft blue gaze meeting mine. She blinked, disoriented, before her eyes sharpened with recognition. "Morning," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. But there was something in her tone, something uncertain, like she could sense the tension radiating from me. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as I looked at her, so beautiful, so unaware of the truth that was about to shatter everything between us. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, as she sat up, the blanket slipping off her shoulders. "You look distant." Her concern only deepened the ache in my chest. God, how could I have done this to her? I need to talk to you," I said, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would make it all real. I swallowed, my throat tight. About everything. Her brow furrowed in confusion, and she tilted her head slightly, the light from the window casting a soft glow on her face. The sight of her, so normal, so right, made me feel like I was betraying the very foundation of what we had built. But I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to face the consequences of my choices. She nodded, her eyes searching mine. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone cautious now, as if she could sense the change in me. I sat down beside her, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for hers. The touch of her skin sent a wave of guilt crashing through me, but I forced myself to steady my breath. I can't back out of this. Not anymore. I've made a terrible mistake, Julia, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't know how to explain it, but I've hurt you. I've hurt us. Her face hardened, and I could see the shift in her. Her eyes darkening, lips pressing together as if bracing for something she already knew was coming. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling just slightly, though she was trying to remain composed. But I could hear the crack beneath her words. She knew something was wrong. She had to. I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. I had never felt so exposed, so raw in all my life. I've been seeing someone else. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I could feel the shock ripple through her body stiffening beside me, and I knew, without a doubt, that everything had just changed. Her hands pulled away from mine, her gaze shifting toward the floor, her expression unreadable. I wanted to reach for her, to hold her, but I knew that wasn't what she needed. Not now. You've been seeing someone else? She repeated, her voice shaking, barely audible. For how long? I closed my eyes, the weight of my betrayal settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I never meant for it to happen. It just did. I could hear the bitterness in my own voice, a reflection of how deeply I had fallen into the chaos of my own desires. I could feel her pain, her disbelief, and it shattered me. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the realization that we were both standing on the edge of something irreparable. Julia finally looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp, piercing through me like a dagger. Who is she? Her words were steady, but there was an edge to them now. The anger was starting to surface, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. I hesitated, the name Mary lingering on my lips like a poison I didn't want to admit. But I couldn't lie to her anymore. It's Mary, I said, my voice barely a whisper, as if saying it aloud would make it even more real. Julia's face went pale, her jaw tightening as if she had been slapped. The hurt in her eyes was unbearable, and I wanted to take it all. To go back to the way things were before I had made this mistake. But I couldn't. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The house felt hollow in the aftermath of our confrontation. Every step I took through the silent rooms echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of what I had destroyed. The air was still, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Julia had gone quiet, retreating to the spare bedroom. I could hear the muffled sound of her movements behind the door, the soft scrape of fabric as she changed into something more comfortable. The silence between us was a chasm I didn't know how to cross. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the untouched coffee on the counter, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the sink. The light from outside was cold and gray, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. It felt like the world was slowly dimming, like the vibrancy had drained from everything I once knew. I tried to imagine what she was feeling. Julia, my wife, the woman I had pledged my life to. Was she angry? Was she heartbroken? Was she already planning her exit? The thought of her leaving tore at something deep inside me, a place I hadn't realized was so fragile. I had always known I was capable of making mistakes, but this was something I never expected of myself. I had crossed a line I could never erase. I reached for my phone, mindlessly scrolling through the contacts until my eyes landed on Mary's name. It was a fleeting temptation, this need to connect with her, to find solace in her presence. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the weight of my actions pressing down on me. Maybe it was the realization that I couldn't run from the consequences anymore. A knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts, and I turned, startled, my breath caught in my throat. As I realized it was Julia, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, her face pale but determined. She hadn't said a word since the confrontation, but now the look in her eyes spoke volumes. "I need to know something," she said quietly, her voice tight with emotion. Her gaze never wavered from mine, and I could feel the sharpness of her words cutting through the stillness. "Do you love her?" The question hung in the air like a weight, too heavy for either of us to move. Julia's eyes searched mine as though she were looking for something. An answer, a spark of truth, something that would tell her how much of me was still hers, and how much had already been lost. I stood there, unable to speak. The answer felt too simple, too painful. The truth was complicated, layered in a way that I couldn't even begin to explain. Did I love Mary? Yes, in some way. But I had loved Julia first. I had loved her in ways that went beyond the physical, beyond the fleeting desires. We had built something together, something that had always felt real, even when it was broken. But now, after everything, I didn't know what was left. Could love survive the weight of betrayal? Could it weather the storm of broken promises and shattered trust? I don't know, I finally whispered, the words escaping like a confession, though I wasn't sure to whom I was confessing. I don't know what love is anymore. Julia's lips pressed together, her jaw clenched with the effort of holding back her emotions. For a moment, I thought she might cry, might crumble under the weight of it all. But instead, she stood there, her back straight, her shoulders squared as though she were bracing herself for a storm. "I can't keep doing this," she said softly. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I can't keep living in a lie." Her voice was calm, but the finality in it shattered me. It wasn't just a decision. It was a conclusion, an inevitable end to something I had long neglected. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," I said, my voice raw, cracked. "But please don't walk away." Julia shook her head, the motion slow, deliberate, as if she were trying to clear her mind of the cloud of doubt and hurt I had placed there. "I can't stay. Not like this. Not when I don't even know who you are anymore." Her words cut through me like a knife, each syllable a reflection of everything I had done wrong. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I was still the person she had loved once. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make her stay, make her believe that we could fix this. But I knew that was just a desperate hope. It wasn't enough anymore. She stood there for a moment longer, looking at me, as if she were waiting for something to change. But when I didn't speak, when I didn't reach out to her, she turned and walked away. Each step she took felt like the world falling apart. Her footsteps echoed in my ears, each one a final nail in the coffin of what we had once shared. I heard the sound of the door closing softly behind her, and then silence. The silence in the house was unbearable, more suffocating than any noise could ever be. Chapter 11. Reckoning. The days that followed Julia's departure were a blur. Time had become something alien to me, stretching out into an endless void, punctuated only by the hollow thrum of my own thoughts. I moved through the motions of my life, but everything felt like a dream, a distant memory of something that had once been real. Julia's absence was a physical ache, a constant reminder of the gulf I had created between us. Her things were still here, scattered around the house, her favorite coffee mug on the kitchen counter, her shoes by the door, the soft scent of her perfume lingering in the air, as if her presence was still somehow etched into the very walls. It was a cruel reminder, but I couldn't bring myself to move any of it. The house felt like a shrine to what we had been. I spent the first few nights on the couch, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind raced with the memories of her laughter, her touch, the way she would always reach for my hand when we walked together. I tried to hold on to those moments, to bury myself in them, as if they could somehow fill the void she had left behind. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. Had I really lost her? The question replayed over and over in my mind, each time hitting me like a fist to the gut. I had betrayed her, destroyed the trust we had built together, and now I was left with the wreckage. I tried to reach out to her, sending text messages and making calls, but there was no response. She had gone silent, retreating into herself, as if she had already moved on from me. How could she move on so easily? The thought gnawed at me, bitter and raw. I wasn't sure if I was angry, hurt, or just desperate. In the rare moments I did sleep, my dreams were filled with her, her eyes, her voice, the way she used to smile at me when I wasn't paying attention. But when I would wake up, the emptiness would settle back in, colder and more unbearable than before. I didn't know where she had gone. The last time I had seen her, she had packed a bag and left without a word, without a second glance. I had begged her to stay, pleaded with her not to walk away, but she had simply turned her back on me, as if she had already made peace with it all. Maybe I deserve this, I thought, as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, staring at the empty space where she had once sat. Maybe this is what I get for being weak, for being selfish. I could feel the weight of my own failure pressing down on me, suffocating me, until I couldn't breathe. I had been so caught up in my own desires, my own fleeting need for something new, that I hadn't even realized what I was risking. I hadn't realized what I could lose. But now, here I was, in the ruins of it all. I tried to think back to the moment when things had started to slip. When had I stopped seeing Julia for who she was? When had I let my own selfishness take over? It seemed like such a small thing at first, just a moment of weakness, a fleeting temptation. But then it had become something more, something I couldn't stop. I thought of Mary. Her presence in my life had been intoxicating at first. An escape from the monotony, a fleeting thrill. But now, in the aftermath, she felt like a shadow, a ghost of something I no longer wanted. I had made the mistake of using her as a distraction from the emptiness inside me, but now that the dust had settled, I couldn't deny the truth. I had never loved her. Not in the way I had loved Julia. What was I even doing, I thought. My head spinning. I can't just erase the past. I can't pretend I didn't hurt her. I stood up abruptly, the urgency of my own thoughts propelling me forward. I needed to do something, anything, to fix this, to bring some semblance of control back into my life. But where could I even begin? What could I say to make it right? I walked to the door, stopping only to glance at the coat rack by the entrance. Julia's jacket was still hanging there, as if she had just left moments ago, as if she could walk back through that door at any moment. My hand hovered over the handle, but I hesitated. Could I really face her again? Could I stand in front of her and beg for her forgiveness? Was it even worth it? Maybe she had already made her decision. Maybe I was too late. I turned away from the door, my body heavy with indecision. I hadn't spoken to her in days, and I hadn't even seen her face. The silence between us was deafening. The time apart had only made the distance between us grow wider, and I didn't know how to bridge that gap. But then, as if answering my unspoken thoughts, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text notification. It was from Julia. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message, my hands trembling. "We need to talk." The words were simple, but they hit me like a tidal wave. I stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Could this be the chance I had been waiting for?